Greetings, friends! Wanningerski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of July 7th through July 13th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around, be awesome, keep being amazing. We're going to be going straight into it, into these amazing gains that are happening. We're going to go starting off in the south and west direction, because this is where, apparently, where a lot of amazing things are happening. It's not as, the thing about the south and west direction, a lot of people don't really are sleeping on it, because, when they look at the Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka direction, they're like, whoa, look at these huge, cities that the Russians are fighting over. Kostiantynivka has a population of, I think, of 75,000. The Pokrovsk, Minigrad cities, when you take them together, because they're basically one big urban agglomeration, is a city of 100,000 pre-war, obviously. But, so it's like, oh, wow, there's a big fight for, a big thing. And then in the south and west direction, it's like, well, what exactly are they fighting for? All these, they're making a lot of gains, but what exactly are they? It's, there's not, a big goal, exactly that's, what is all these gains accumulating towards? But, I still think it's pretty neat, the south and west direction. Anyway, this week we have a lot of big updates. The biggest update is that we got this update today with GLK confirmation, but this was, we basically got that this happened a few days ago, but the Russians have completely captured the village of Myrnia. This map is not updated yet, but we have GLK confirmation of the Russians raising the flags in the village of Myrnia, and most mappers have basically shown that this entire area of Myrnia has been captured by the Russians in this past week. Now the Russians, last week they captured the village of Podudia, and that was their kind of bridgehead on the other side of the Volga River, and now they're expanding their presence in that area. And so now that with the capture of Myrnia and Podumia, and before let's not, they also, we talked about how the Russians were in Tolstoy last week, but we didn't get confirmation of them actually raising their flags here. But we did earlier this week. So the Russians have also captured completely the village of Tolstoya. Not as big as Podunia and Myrnia, because these are two decent-sized towns that the Russians could accumulate forces in, but the captured Tolstoya anchors their northern flank. This map is also not updated, but most sources are saying that the Russians have also captured the village of Grushevka, which I don't think is a village. I think it's just a village in name only. I mean, maybe there's one or two houses, but yeah, there's nothing there. But anyway, this area that says it's a village was captured. And also, we have GLK confirmation of the Russians actually being in Novoekonomichne. The Ukrainians were bombing the Russians in this area. So we know now they haven't captured this village, but I am almost certain that they will capture this village in the next time I do this update next week, considering they made a giant push and managed to actually enter Novoekonomichne. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, take everything up to the Volga River here, and then, by the end of next week. Anyway, but since the Russians are about to finish that, the Russians have a very solid bridgehead now on the other side of the Volga River. Before, it was gonna, if they entered Podunia, they could have been outflanked from the north or south. They could have been attacked at multiple angles. But now with this, the Russians are going to create a very solid bridgehead in this area. This would basically allow them to accumulate forces, and then they could just continue pushing through the fields, and there won't be any more of ways to, how do you say it? It won't be hard for them to continue marching now that they're past the river and have a bridgehead. So now at that point, as I mentioned last week, the rest of this is to capture the rest of the South Donetsk area. Capture Zelona High, Andriivka, Klitsovo, Alexandrogard, Voskarenka. And, I talked about this last week about what the Russians could do. I'm pretty certain the Russians are going to try to take everything behind the river, and just because just to take the rest of South Donbass. From that point, there's two things the Russians could do. They either cross the river and create another bridgehead on the other side of the Volga River, take, the towns of Ivanovka, Goralovka, create another bridgehead here, and then also be able to outflank Novoekonomichne and actually start battle. This is one of the main areas the Russians in this kind of in the more Pokrovsk direction are trying to take as well. So, may take Novoekonomichne, Ivanovka, Goralovka, create a bridgehead here on the other side of Volga River. But then it's going to be very hard for them to continue advancing towards Prozny, towards Mazova, because it's just a bunch of empty fields, and the Ukrainians have a bunch of solid, trench networks here. They have a railroad, roads, highways. Their logistics here are very solid. So, the Russians are just going to be pushing through empty fields. So it's going to be very hard for them to go there. So, they could either do that, or they could continue moving in a southwest direction and start trying to, take a bunch of these villages to the south of the Vochka River here and start, trying to reach Uspenivka, try to cut this highway that connects Gallipoli, and then help start battling, start the process of battling for Gallipoli. So those are the two options I see. Also, the Russians have captured a bunch of these fields towards Voskrerenka. A lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that the Russians are battling for this village already, or in it. We don't have any geolocated confirmation of that, like we do for the town of Novoekonomichne, but most pro-Russian sources are saying that the Russians are battling for this village and are battling for this village as well, and that they should be able to take them within this week. But yeah, we do have a bunch of confirmation of the Russians taking a bunch of these fields in this area here. And so we also had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the south here, so I have no doubts that the Russians definitely can be in this area. We just need someone to actually post a video. Maybe the Ukrainians are droning the Russians there, but in any case, or maybe the Russians are just waiting to clear this up. But in any case, I do think the Russians are going to, clear this area, and then, push towards the Volchka River, because now, since they've have a bridge here, it's only a matter of time. I actually wouldn't be surprised if, considering how fast the progress is, that by the end of July, that the Russians take everything in this area here, and then liberate South Donetsk. So that would be a very interesting gain for the Russians here. And yeah, and then everything else in the South Donetsk direction, the Russians captured a few of these fields to the west of Leopolia. Some sources are saying the Russians are now, as they move to the north of Shentenka, are trying to enter the Dnipro Oblast here and try to gain a foothold into the village of Malinovka, but we don't have any confirmation of that just yet. Just some sources saying that's what's happening. But anyway, so that is the South Donetsk direction. A lot of interesting things happening, and I can't wait to see what's the next chapter going to be for that. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Zaporizhzhia direction, and in the Zaporizhzhia direction, the Russians have completely captured the village of Kamyanska. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians now entering the village of Plavny. As you can see, the village of Plavny and Kamyanska, they kind of bleed into each other, so, where one begins, where one ends is, it doesn't really matter. But anyway, we have the Russians being in this, kind of residential area here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue clearing these residential buildings and continue pushing outwards, maybe take a few of these areas. But anyway, we do know that the Russians have captured at least the southern part of this residential area, the southern part of Plavny. Also, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the northern part of Kamyanska. The only place we don't have them raising their flags is in the most northern part of this village here, in this kind of little residential neighborhood. But most mappers have shown that they've captured this residential area and thus have completely captured the town of Kamyanska, which is a very good gain for the Russians. Along with this, the Russians are improving their positions between Kamyanska and Stepova, capturing a bunch of these fields between that. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, I do think the Russians will push a little bit further up in Plavny, but I don't think, a lot of people are like, oh, now they're going to go for Stepanhersk. The thing is that if they try to advance towards Stepanhersk, if they start battling for it, their flank is going to be exposed, and it's going to be very hard for them to start battling for it. And along this, the Ukrainians have the citadel of Stepanhersk. They have, Stepanhersk is a pretty decent-sized town, and it's going to be very hard for the Russians to just assault it directly. So I do think instead of advancing it directly on Stepanhersk, I think the Russians are going to stop, midway here or something, just between in Plavny, and then kind of focus on these fields to the east of Kamyanska. So maybe try to move north from Malosherbiki and Stepova and try to take a bunch of these kind of fields, so that it kind of helps, improve their positions here. And then they could have a highway here where they could have better logistics instead of this literally being the front line where any Ukrainian attack could, basically directly enter them and disrupt them. But I do think that for the Zaporizhzhia offensive, the Russians are going to focus, trying to take some of these fields to the east of Kamyanska and kind of north of this area. And then from here, I think instead of going continuously towards Stepanhersk, I do think the Russians are going to start trying to focus on towards Novoekonomichne and try to push kind of in this direction here. So we shall see how that develops. But yeah, Kamyanska has been completely liberated, so that is a good gain for the Russians. And then also in the kind of more Gallipoli area, we talked about the Russians completely liberated the village of Malinovka, but we don't have any, we don't have geolocated confirmation of the Russians actually raising their flags in the northern part. We have the Russian presence in the southern and central part. We just don't have any, but we don't know if they actually captured it fully yet. So but most mappers are saying that this is captured, so I mean, it definitely could happen. But also the change this week is that the Russians have captured a bunch of these fields to the west of Malinovka. And that kind of shows the progression of what I assumed where the Russians are going to go. They're going to continue pushing in this direction towards the village of Vasovka, Zelena High, and Vasolia, and just, capture a bunch of these areas here. So I do, that might be the next area of the Russian offensive here, instead of continuously going north towards Poltavka here. So Yeah, just, if Malinivka has been captured, which is definitely a possibility, this gives the Russians a small foothold to continue developing their offensive to outflank Gallipoli. And this could also, again, the movements here could coincide with once the Russians completely liberate South Donetsk. Um, um, this could, as the Russians push this way and the Russians push this way, this could allow them to start, putting the pressure on Gallipoli. Alrighty. Now we're going to go to the Pokrovsk direction, and in the Pokrovsk direction, this is actually where a lot of interesting, there's things that are happening, and there are things that might happen, and there's a bunch, it's like a quantum field things, a bunch of shit happening. But now, in terms of the west of Pokrovsk, the most interesting things are happening near Leningrad, actually. But in the western part of Pokrovsk, there's actually been no changes. The Russians are still batting for Borovka. The Russians are right on the Dnipropetrovsk border. They're still on the outskirts, have positions in Udachna, but are not actually trying to capture this town for some reason. But anyway, so there's been no changes here. But what there's actually been changes is in the eastern part of Pokrovsk, this Pokrovsk direction, this area, and this is where it gets very interesting. So now there's things that are confirmed, and that from geolocations and from what map updates are from map updaters with sources on the ground, and then there's like what a bunch of pro-Russian sources are saying. So this is not just like one kook. This is not just one guy. This is what multiple pro-Russian sources are saying. And what they're saying is that there's a big breakthrough happening in this area. First, let's talk about what everyone pretty much agrees on that happened this week, even the pro-Ukrainian side. So this week, one of the biggest things that actually has been showing with GLK confirmation is that the Russians have completely had a breakthrough into the village or the town of Novoekonomichne. This is the one of the biggest defenses the Ukrainians are using to defend their eastern flank in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. And this week we had GLK confirmation of the Russians entering the most southern part of this of Novoekonomichne and disembarking troops. Now that was a few days ago. We haven't had any more GLK confirmation since then. But it does show that the Russians did enter this kind of southern part, and it does seem like everything kind of behind this red line to here or some shit like that has been taken by the Russians, but we don't know yet. We need more updates. We saw the Russians, sending a bunch of troops in there with tanks and armored vehicles, and then disembarking the troops, and then retreating. So it's definitely, the Russians are there, but we don't know if the Russians did they get wiped out? Did they consolidate? We shall see. But if they are here and they have consolidated, in fact, this week we had the Ministry of Defense say they completely captured the village in Nikolaevka, this area on the other side of the Kerensky Tereska, or this little village here. So if that is the case, that means that the Russians have, this shows that the Russians have captured the southern part of Novoekonomichne, because this kind of, with the breakdown here, the Ukrainians probably fled from their positions here towards the more central part of Novoekonomichne. In any case, this show that according to pro-Russian sources and such, this is what it's looking like. Everything behind this red line is what the Russians have been taken. So have taken. So we shall see how that develops. It's kind of interesting how they still think Myrolyubivka is in a gray zone. This map, Syriac says the Russians, attacked Novoekonomichne from like kind of their positions in like Malinivka in this area, not from Myrolyubivka, but. In any case, I do think the village of Myrolyubivka, if you want to be very charitable to the Ukrainians, is in the gray zone here. But in any case, I do think it's actually under Russian control. Considering now that they're, the Ukrainians are going to have a very hard time supplying their forces on the other side of this river here. So I do think they're kind of retreating on the other side of the river and trying to hold. They have a bunch of trenches. They have this giant substation. They have, Novoekonomichne in the center and north of it. So they still could defend their flank a little bit, but it's the Russians getting closer and closer here. So we have to wait for more updates to see if the Russians consolidate their positions in Novoekonomichne and see how that develops. Anyway, and then a little bit more. Now that was very interesting about the battle for Novoekonomichne starting. But where there's been the most interesting changes is in this area here. Now this is where the most the difference between what's actually happening on the ground versus what people are saying is the biggest. So in terms of what most mappers are saying is that the Russians have captured most of the village of Novoteretska. Considering it's on the other side of this river, the Russians pretty much didn't, they didn't have to cross the river or anything, so it was very easy for them to enter here. Most sources are saying that the Russians have taken almost all of Novoekonomichne, except the most northern part. And the reason for that is because the northern part is this like just one-way street village, and so this kind of northern part is not under Russian control, but this kind of central part, which is the most important part because it has all these big buildings in it, has been taken. So almost all of Novoekonomichne has been captured by the Russians. And we have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of tree line to the east of Novoekonomichne. So that shows that the Russians are trying to improve their positions to the north of their gains here and such. And then also we had we talked about how the Russians captured Razny and so forth. So this is what Razny Novoekonomichne has been captured, and the Russians have a small bridgehead on the other side of the Kerensky-Tereshk River. That is what most mappers and most people are saying it's true. And but if you look at pro-Russian sources, if you look at what they're saying, there is a very interesting dynamic happening here. If you look at what they're saying is that the Russians have not only are here, but they've also captured the village of Bofivka and Fedorivka. And there's a bunch of trenches here because the Ukrainians, we're trying to use the river as a natural defense. But if you look at pro-Russian mappers, they're saying they have captured the village of Bofivka, Fedorivka. They also are now, moving north here and are now entering right on the outskirts of the village of Mayaka. Along with this, the biggest interesting things is that the Russians have made a big breakthrough here and have entered like kind of these reservoirs here and captured, and are now entering here and have captured this mining shaft right here. Along with this, some pro-Russian sources are saying that they have also entered the northern part of Novoekonomichne here and are now like right on the outskirts of this kind of Terrakon here. So if you look at what the Russians are actually saying, and they're also saying that the Russians are now entering Chermolimania here, this area right here, and they're like right on the outskirts of Rodonsky here, which is one of the main targets for the Russians here. Because the fall of Rodonsky, this decent-sized town here, would basically cut off the most major supply route to Pokrovsk and Leningrad. But if you look at what the Russians are saying they have, it's something like this. So this is what the Russians are saying they have. So as you can see, if this is true, then the Russians have significant success in the eastern flank of the Pokrovsk agglomeration here. So very interesting dynamic here. I do think what the Russians will do with this position is there's multiple things they could do. They continue pushing north here just to secure their northern flank a little bit. They might continue pushing towards this rail line here just to move here, take the village of Zaporizhzhia and Shukivsky here. They're going to probably also try to move here, try to secure this Terrakon, and if they actually are in the northern part of Novoekonomichne and they actually have secured themselves in the southern part, they're going to probably try to secure Novoekonomichne fully. And then at this point, they might continue pushing, this way, try to battle for the substation and take it, and basically take a bunch of these like defenses here. And then from this point, I think the Russians are going to try to battle for the Rodinsky mine, this area right here. The capture of this mine and the Terrakon here will give the Russians a height advantage, which will then allow them to then start battling for Rodinsky. So then, again, the main goal for this whole Russian offensive here is something like this. Capture, all the fields like this. And then from here, this would, if you look at kind of the bigger scope here, based on what's happening, at that point, as you can see, let's say, the Russians are at this point right here, right? So if the Russians take something like this, as you can see, you can see the the outflanking maneuver, putting the squeeze on this Pokrovsk-Leningrad agglomeration. At this point, then it's going to be up to the forces in the western part of Pokrovsk to start activating again. They have to take Udachna, secure their flank a little bit, and then start moving this way. Start moving along this rail line, start trying to enter the village of Grishivka and cut this area here. Take something like this. And just cut this area here. And at this point, then there's only gonna be some local roads right, literally to the north of Pokrovsk that they might use. So, but at this point, it's gonna be very, they're gonna be put a lot of squeeze on this agglomeration. So if the Russians do something like this and capture Rodinsky and take something like this, then I'm counting like literally like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month before this entire area is completely captured. And then obviously the main goal for the Russians is to take everything behind this red line, and then move up here, and then the Ukrainians will fall back to Doropilia, where they'll make their next defense line. Anyway, lots of interesting things happening in Pokrovsk, but we need more confirmation to see if that is where the Russians actually are. Anyway, now we're going to go to the Kostiantynivka direction, and there's been some interesting things happening here. Let's go from east to west. Anyway, actually from west to east, I should say. Actually, anyway, so in this area, we had JLK confirmation of the Russians clearing some areas in Polva Yar again. So it looks like Polva Yar is a bit of a gray zone; it's not completely captured. The map has been updated to show that Poltavka and Rusin Yar are still under full Ukrainian control. Before it showed that the Russians were in these two villages, but it does show that the Ukrainians are still holding on to these three villages here, or at least Polva Yar is like a gray zone, or maybe the Russians are in control of it because we did see the Russians clearing buildings there. But it does show that if they're clearing buildings here, that means it was not fully in control like before. But anyway, most sources are saying that they've captured a bunch of these fields, to the south of these villages, and that it's just that being in the fields is it's hard to just directly attack. But anyway. It does show that the Ukrainians still have a very solid, because if they lost Rusin Yar, Poltavka, and Polva Yar, that would be a very big disaster for the Ukrainians. But the Russians obviously want to capture this area, capture something like this, because if they could take these three villages, this would be kind of the linchpin that would completely devastate, Ukraine positions in Kostiantynivka. Because from here, they could then start battling for these three villages that hold the defense of the western part of Kostiantynivka. Taking these three villages allows the Russians to start moving towards the village of Shovkovko if they want to continue moving northwards from here to secure the northern flank. So these three villages are very important. The Ukrainians are, are still in control of most of these villages except Polva Yar. So that is some changes here, but the Russians are controlling the fields, all the fields to the south of it. And then where the Russians are making the biggest, or not the biggest, but like where it's the biggest, where the capture of which is the most important, is the village of Yablunovka. The Russians took another trench line. If you look at the trench map that I posted last time, there's a bunch of company strongholds that are along this river here that I think there's like one here, there's like one here, but the Russians took another big one here, and because of this they were able to capture more of the center of Yablunovka, so that's good. The thing is with the Russian doing this trench hopping is that the Ukrainians could just accumulate forces in Kostiantynivka to continue doing massive attacks on the Russians here, and so it's very hard for the Russians to continue moving, in this direction here. They're going to have to advance in multiple directions here. But in any case, because, if the Russians just continue trying to, take this next trench network, which is here, Ukrainians could try to attack them. And, as you can see, their northern flank is exposed. So that's why it's taking a long time to take Lyubunovka. But they took another trench network, and they've captured more of the center of Lyubunovka. So they're making slow and steady progress here. And then over here, we had most mappers are saying that Alexander Kelenovo is in the gray zone. The Russians sometimes enter it, the Ukrainians enter it, so no one's in full control of it. A lot of pro-Ukrainians are like, no, we're still in full control of it. I don't think that's true. We had JLK confirmation of the Russians literally entering it and being there. Obviously, they could have been destroyed, but that shows that the Ukrainian positions here is not as secure as they say. I do think, but it does show that Russians are not in control of Alexander Kelenovo, and that means that this kind of highway, even though it's under complete drone domination, is still open. It's not physically blocked, so the Ukrainians could use this to support their positions in Kupyansk and Katerinivka here. So yeah, the Russians are trying to really reach the Kupyansk reservoir here, and then towards Toretsk itself, the Russians have captured more of these fields to the south of Katerinivka. So it does show that the Russians are now trying to use these fields, since the Ukrainians have a lot of positions in Yablunovka, Alexander Kelenovo in this area, but in these fields here there's not as much defenses, so the Russians are just kind of using it to kind of break through here, and they're about to reach, they are right on the outskirts of the village of Katerinivka. So we shall see if the Russians are able to maybe do some storm attacks and try to enter Katerinivka in the next coming week or so. But again, the Ukrainians, they have all their, they're not squeezed on any side, so they could defend Katerinivka if they need to, especially now that the Russians aren't as secure in Alexander Kelenovo as we previously thought. But it does show the Russians getting closer and closer to Katerinivka, and the fall of it will facilitate, along with Kupyansk, will facilitate the fall of Shyrbrenka and Novoekonomichne, which is the main goal for the Russians. The main goal for the Russians here is just to reach the reservoir here and take everything to the south of it, of this red line. So, yeah. And then a little bit more here towards this area, the Russians took a few more fields between the Delivkas here. They took these fields right here. So just, improving their positions here. As I mentioned, they're going to continue moving along this rail line to the north of Delivka, and, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians try to take everything to the south of this red line next week. And this would allow them to start, maybe advancing more into Bilohora and start reaching the village of Alexander Shutina, which is the main Russian goal for this offensive here. So just a little bit of movements in the fields here, but nothing too big. And then in the Chasiv Yar area of this Konstantinivka direction, we do have now that we're getting more and more updates. It does show that the Ukrainians are still in the village of Mykolaiivka, so that does kind of complicate things. It does show that the Russians are probably still in control of the microdistrict. What did they call it? I forgot what they call this microdistrict, but it's but anyway, but it does kind of complicate the Russians' plans to try to cut off this forest that's near Chasiv Yar, because if the Russians were in Mykolaiivka and actually captured it, they could then use Mykolaiivka to hook up with the Russians that are in this northern microdistrict and then cut off this entire forest and take it. And then from that point, all they would have to do is take this last kind of neighborhood here, and at that point, then they could finally say they've liberated Chasiv Yar. So, that is, but since the Ukrainians are still in Mykolaiivka, that does kind of complicate the Russian plans to try to cut off this forest here. But, but besides that, there's been no other changes in that kind of Chasiv Yar area. All right, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction. There's been no really changes in the Seversk direction. The battle for Severbrenka is still ongoing. A lot of sources are showing that the Russians, from Verkhomansk are trying to enter kind of these trenches that are on the outskirts of Seversk, but we don't know, obviously that's going to be a very bad idea because the Ukrainians are still in, they have to take Severbrenka and they have to take the rest of this hill here. They have to take something like this if they want to actually maybe have positions here. I do think what the Russians should do is that after they share Severbrenka and the rest of this hill, is then take these trenches that are to the north of Seversk, because then it's on the other side of the river, and it allows the Russians to then maybe enter Seversk from the north here. So I think, taking everything to the other side of this river and these hills would allow the Russians to enter Seversk. But besides that, there's been no really big changes. But the Russians want to keep entering Seversk. It's it's going to be a very hard time for them without securing Severbrenka first. But anyway, we're actually going to go straight to Lyman, because this is where some very interesting things are happening as well. So in the Lyman direction, this week, the Russians have completely captured the village of Zuluno-Dolinia. Finally, we had geolocated confirmation that the Russians raising their flags. Forever, for the last month or so, the Russians have, most mappers have shown that the Russians captured a bunch of these fields around it. But I'm like, okay, why, this is not Pokrovsk, this is just a small little village. And so, I'm like, why is it taking such a long time for the Russians to take Zuluno-Dolinia? So, I was kind of confused on why it was taking so long. But in any case, I do think it's, but the Russians have finally taken it, and not only have they taken it, they have actually taken a bunch of these fields around this area. So they're kind of positioned here in this bridgehead on the other side of the Zaporizhzhia River has been completely expanded by a ton. So the changes that are happening this week is that the Russians have taken something like this. Well, actually, so they took Zuluno-Dolinia, but let me so they took some more positions to the south of it. They've taken, I think, all these fields here. So yeah, they when they reached the Kharkovka and took the eastern part of Kharkovka and Ridkodub, and they reached this other river here. What do they call this river? I don't think they allow me to see what the river is called, but there's like a river that separates here. I think called the Nevsky River or something. But anyway, the Russians entered it, and from here, now the Russians are now finally pushing southwards, and they're going to use this river as a natural defense as they move southwards towards one of the main goals as they try to reach Lyman, or at least well, not a goal, but the next goal the Russians have to take is the village of Shandura-Kolovo here. So the capture of this, along with the capture of Kolodasky, will give them a solid positioning, like right this, to then accumulate forces to start pushing southwards here towards Novoekonomichne here, Zaporizhzhia, and then from here the Russians, I think, are going to also push north along this river to maybe just flatten the front line with Ridkodub here, and take more of the Luhansk Oblast, at least the fields of it. There's two big trench networks that are right here that the Russians have to take, which will secure their positions in the Luhansk Oblast a little bit more. But yeah, this is where I think the Russians are going to try to push towards. They're going to push towards the Nevsky River, which will protect their western flank, and then they're going to start moving north and south. I think they're not going to continue. I think their main goal here is obviously Lyman. So I think they're going to just have a very solid position, or have their northern flank secured, and then just continue pushing south here. Maybe they cross the Nasky River and try to reach the Osko River here, and that would be a very interesting gain for the Russians. But we shall see. But yeah, and then also, so yeah, the Volozhilona linia is very good, and we shall see how the Russians develop. And they've taken the eastern part of Kharkovka, so maybe next time the Russians continue taking more of these fields, and as they reach the outskirts of this village. So we shall see how that develops. And then also, the Russians are going back and forth in Ridkodub. A lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians enter it, and then the Russians push them out. So there's this like tug of war going on in Ridkodub, which the Ukrainians sent the Azov brigade here to accumulate to push the Russians out of here. So it's a very interesting on. And I think that was a very good tactical decision. The Azov brigade is one of the best units they have in this direction, and contesting Ridkodub really much complicates the Russian offensive here, because if the Russians were not contested, then with their position in Novi or Ridkodub, they could basically have this would have allowed them to expand their bridgehead here very much more better, and complicate the Ukrainian positions in the Lyman direction here. Along with this, the Russians are still battling for Novoekonomichne. The Russians have entered the Naska River, or the Nitrous River, they should say, and there's a small village here called Novoekonomichne here. So I think it's also split in half by the village, like Kharkovka. So when the Russians reached the outskirts of this village, they took the eastern part of it. But the Russian push towards Novoekonomichne and this area is complicated for the fact that Ridkodub is still being contested. But so the Russians need to really push the Ukrainians out of here, and reach the Nitrous River, and then just defend their positions here, and prevent the and since the Ukrainians won't be able to they might be able to accumulate in risky Risodivsky here, or Sumy here, but as they try to push towards Ridkodub, there's just a bunch of open fields, and this should complicate Ukrainian positions to attack the Russians here. Anyway, and then a little bit more north here. Most sources are now saying that the village of Kupyansk is was completely reclaimed by the Ukrainians. This makes sense. When the Russians were in charge of it, I'm like, man, this is a very big salient. I don't think the Russians would be able to actually hold on to it. So now most mappers are saying that Kupyansk has been taken, but Stepova is still under Russian control. So that makes sense. So this does show that since Kupyansk is still under Ukrainian control, why the Ukrainians still have this small bridgehead in the Luhansk Oblast here. So but yeah, so. The Ukrainians used to put the Azov brigade here just because they wanted to prevent the Russians from claiming all of Luhansk Oblast, but there's still the village of Terebilovko, maybe Novoekonomichne, and Nadia. So these three villages are not necessarily under full Ukrainian control, but they're not fully secured yet. It's very hard for the Russians to try to have positions here. So, and actually fully secure Luhansk Oblast. So. But where the Russians are actually making a lot of decent progress, or at least there's a big assault that happened, was, we talked about how last week the Ukrainians have, better positions in the south of Krylovka than we thought, that they've completely almost pushed the Russians fully out of Zaporizhzhia. They're still in full control of Novoekonomichne. They're in these fields to the south of Krylovka. And so, the southern part of this or the northern part of this Lyman direction, reaching the Kupyansk area, was kind of not looking so good for the Russians. But this week we saw the Russians do a massive attack where they disembarked troops to the north of the village of Borsovka and Andriivka here. And so they pushed through a bunch of these fields and disembarked troops here. So we shall see if that develops. Obviously we remember last time the Russians have, positions in Lozova. They captured this a few months ago. I do think maybe the Russians are trying to improve their positions in south of Lozova, and then from here maybe they could then take Borsovka, Andriivka, and Zelona High, and take something like this, and because then this kind of links up with their positions in Stepova, and this gets them closer to the P79 highway, which they can then drone and then complicate the Ukrainian logistics as they try to push towards Krylovka. The main goal for the Russians is to try to take all these villages to the north of Borova, and then this would make their salient here a lot more secure. All right. Now we're going to go to the Kupyansk-Kharkov direction, because they're kind of mixed now. So I'm just calling it the Kupyansk-Kharkov direction, because this Kupyansk is technically part of Kharkov, but it's but technically it's not even, because not really pushing towards Kharkov. The main focus has been in this kind of like, this direction. So, maybe I just would call this entire area the Kupyansk direction or something, because, or maybe the northwest Kharkov direction or something. I'm trying to think if there should be a new way I would name it. But anyway, there's been some changes in this direction. In Kupyansk itself, most sources, before, I think the Russians are still in control of Kondrasovka, Radivka, and Globluvka. I do think these three villages are in Russian control, but some pro-Ukrainian sources are saying no, we're still contesting the Russians here, and so forth. So, we saw the Russians raising their flags here, but and we saw the Russians being in these kind of fields to the north of Globovka, but we don't have any more geolocated confirmation of that. I do think the Russians are in control here, but it's definitely possible that the Ukrainians could re-enter here. So these three villages are what the Russians are still contesting for. If they are in full control of it, the Ukrainians are preventing them from trying to continuously advancing. Again, the Russian position, the Russian claim that they took Moskovka and Solobolivka are completely bullshit. They are not in control of these two areas. But I do think the Russians are in control of these three villages. But it's going to be the Ukrainians are trying to definitely make it a hard time. And as I said, they could take these three, but if they actually want to secure it, they have to take a bunch of more of these villages. Once they create this bridge, they wanted to go straight for Kupyansk. But again, this is Russian commanders trying to get glory. They're like, oh, we took Kupyansk, which would be a very big gain for the Russians. But like, if you want to take Kupyansk, you have to actually secure your bridge a bit more. You can't just have a small bridge here and then that's it. You have to, take, Velika, Sharpovki, Monochenivka, and just have, improve your, secure your northern defenses before you actually start moving south towards Kupyansk. So, the Russians trying to storm towards Kupyansk is going to, unless they take more of these villages, will be a very hard time for them. And then a bit more here, the Russians did some advancements actually for the first time in a while in this area in the eastern part of Kupyansk, taking some of these fields here, advancing a little bit here in these fields to the east of Petropavlovka, but nothing major here that would actually change anything. Just looks like the Russians are putting pressure here or something. And then a little bit more here, we talked about how last week the Russians made another offensive operation to enter, capture the village of Belova. And this week we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians doing this massive attack and taking in this tree line right here, right on the outskirts of the village of Kanati here. So it does show that, before all we had was geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising their flags in Belova, but it was the map updates that showed that they've taken the tree lines around it. So, but we got geolocated confirmation this week of the Russians, disembarking troops in this tree line here, or maybe it was I forgot, maybe it was the Ukrainians trying to bomb the Russians here. But anyway, this does show that the Russians actually have positions in a bunch of these fields. But besides that, there's not been any major changes here. It looks like the Russians are trying to reach the village of Kostiantynivka and Arbarda, which makes sense. But I talked about last week about what the Russians could do here, but it does seem like that this was just an opportunistic attack here just to drive Ukrainian forces here, because we've actually got another, not geolocated confirmation, but some sources are saying the Russians have captured the village of Dorania here, which makes sense. Again, this is like this sticks out like a sore thumb into Russian position, so it does make sense for the Russians to take this. So it seems like this is just somewhere the Russians are just entering multiple points here to try to like make it hard for the Russians to, or for the Ukrainians to actually defend their positions here. So, they're like, or not defend, but like, they're trying to drag reinforcements here. So it does show that the Kupyansk-Kharkov direction is more of a distraction operation to drag in Ukrainian reinforcements than it is to be like a main axis of Russian attacks here. Anyway. Now let us go finally to the Sumy direction, and there's been some small changes in this direction. Let's start from Myriopolya. This week, the Russians are now the battle for Myriopolya has begun. Before we had the Russians crossed the border, took the village of Alexandrivka here, but they weren't actually in Myriopolya. But this week, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the most northern outskirts of Myriopolya, and now the battle for this village is ongoing. This makes sense, because the main goal for the Russians, taking Myriopolya will give the Russians a very solid stronghold, like on this eastern part of Sumy. Again, there's this river here that goes like this, so their flank is supported here, and then they could take everything behind, try to liquidate this little pimple that kind of breaks into Russia here. So I do think the Russians will take Myriopolya, or at least that's what it seems like they're kind of trying to do. But yeah, they're now in the northern part of this town, and we shall see how that develops. Anyway, so yeah, we shall see if the Russians can take Myriopolya. And then a little bit more here, in kind of the main Sumy direction. It's actually the Ukrainians that actually have a lot of success. Before they recaptured the village of Andriivka, now they're actually now battling for the village of Kinderjurovki here. This was a very decent sized town with, or village that the Russians took, which I'm like, wow, this protects the Russians very solidly in the Sumy direction as they try to reach towards Kotina. But it seems like the Ukrainians understood the importance of defending Kotina, so they're not doing a bunch of offensive operations, and they actually entered the most northern part of Kinderjurovka here. Now, we don't have any confirmation that the Ukrainians have completely recaptured that town yet, or that village, but it does show that the Ukrainians are trying to complicate Russian positions here, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians fall back to the other side of this area, this kind of small little reservoir here. And just try to defend their positions in Alexiivka here. Because if they lose Alexiivka, then their entire kind of western defense kind of bridgehead they're trying to develop in Sumy would be compromised. But yeah, so the Ukrainians are definitely putting up a decent fight. We talked about the Russians have captured half of Yunatovka, but the southern part is still under Ukrainian control. So definitely the Russians have been radically slowed down here because the Ukrainians are now on the counterattack. Now, where the Ukrainians used to be on the counterattack, but now the Russians are in the counterattack in the Sumy direction is in the village of Techno here. We talked about how the Ukrainians basically lost their offensive operation to try to take Techno because I think they redeployed all the assault units from this area to try to counteract the Russians here. And this allowed the Russians to then start reclaiming their area here. This week we had GLK confirmation of the Russians entering the Sumy Oblast and taking the village of Biselivka here. Biselivka here. And this basically allows them to, this gives them, secures their just a little bridgehead here. And then also, we don't have a GLK confirmation of this, but pro-Russians are saying that they are crossing the Sumy-Kursk border and are now entering the village of Rizhivka here. They have captured a few of these houses on the border. So it does show that, I do think what the Russians are going to try to do here, because they have some forces that are trying to counteract the Ukrainian offensive here, is to try to take, something like this, I think. Try to, just because once they do that, this makes the Techno kind of salient, because the way this border is, as you can see, Techno is surrounded on multiple angles, and if the Russians could push out of here and just capture a bunch of these villages, this gives them a buffer zone and makes it less of a salient and more of a solid front line. And from that point, the main goal for the Russian, this might just be, this is kind of far in the future. They obviously, but one of the biggest things the Russians could do is take the village of Bilopilia and Vorzabivka here, because if they could capture this cuts off one of the major supply routes that supplies Sumy from the west here. So we shall see how that develops here. So yeah, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukraine war update. The Russians are now also droning the hell out of Ukraine. Droning using almost hundreds of drones per day. So the drone production is definitely increasing by a lot. Anyway, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. Be sure to like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Keep being awesome. And I hope you have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.